Okay, so yesterday we talked about, give a brief introduction to the field of ethics, ethics being the branch of philosophy that deals with questions about good and bad and right and wrong. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to briefly talk about whether or not we're going to talk about the most basic kind of question you can ask in the field of ethics, right? The most basic kind of question that you can ask in the field of ethics, the most abstract question you can ask about good and bad and right and wrong, is whether or not there are facts of the matter to be known. Are there moral truths, right? Lots of people disagree about lots of things. People disagree about what kind of music to listen to. They disagree about what kind of clothes to wear. They disagree about, whether or not The Last Jedi was a good movie. And all of these different opinions are out there. And for the most part, we just learn to agree to disagree about these sorts of issues, right? Maybe you have a friend who eats sushi, and you just don't go out with them when they eat sushi. Maybe you have a friend who liked The Last Jedi, and you just don't hang out with that person anymore. When it comes to a lot of disagreements, we just sort of agree to disagree. So some people have proposed that maybe moral disagreements have the same kind of status, right? That some people think it's wrong to steal, and some people think it's okay to steal if you're sure you can get away with it. Maybe those people just agree to disagree, right? So that's what we're going to talk to some degree today. We're going to talk about the most basic level of moral and ethical questioning, and that is this question. Are there moral facts? Are there moral facts? Are there truths to be known about good and bad and right and wrong? Now, I would propose that that when answering this question, there are at least two ways to answer this question: yes and no. Oops. Now, if you answer no to this question, if you say there are no moral facts, there are no moral truths, you probably hold the position that claims about morality, about good and bad and right and wrong, hold the same status as people's opinions about movies, people's opinions about food, and so on, that we all just have to learn to disagree. There's no fact of the matter about whether or not it's blue cheese is good. Some people like it, some people hate it, and we all just sort of agree to disagree, right? If you believe that there are no moral facts, then you have a couple questions to answer, right? You have to answer the question. For instance, what do we mean when we make moral claims, right? If I say that it's it's okay to keep slaves, and somebody else thinks no, it's wrong to keep slaves, what do we mean whenever we say it is good to keep slaves or bad to keep slaves, right? And this is where different varieties of answering no to this question come in, right? And there are a few different approaches to this question. One of them, very broadly speaking, I will call the ways of answering this question no. I will call those one or another other variety of what's called ethical subjectivism. ethical subjectivism goes by a few different names, and if you read different textbooks on this topic, they might call them, they might parse this a little differently and call this by a few different names. But ethical subjectivism, for our conversation here, is going to be the position that moral claims really only express preferences, in the way that opinions only express preferences. So when I say that murder is wrong, all I'm really saying is that I don't like murder, right? When you say that, picking up hitchhikers and killing them for fun is okay, you're really saying, well, I have a preference for picking up hitchhikers and killing them for fun, right? Now, furthermore, we might ask, well, where do these preferences come from, right? And this is, depending on who you ask, a very, very interesting question, right? If you care to be psychological about it, some people, called the emotivists, say that, well, moral claims really just express emotions. Emotions come from lots of different complex psychological and historical factors, right? And that when I say that murder is wrong, the emotivist says, well, all I'm really saying is boo murder. I'm just expressing an opinion, right? In the same way that if I'm at a Cubs game and I say boo Cubs, right? I'm not saying something that expresses a proposition. I'm not saying something that has truth conditions or that could be true or false. I'm really just expressing an emotion, and that emotion is boo Cubs. I hate the Cubs, right? Which, in fact, I do, right? And on the contrary, if I'm up late at night and I see one of those Save the Children's Foundations or, Sarah McLachlan singing a song about helping save baby animals, kittens and puppies, and I give some money to help Sarah McLachlan or save the kids or whatnot, and you hear about this and you say, wow, that was a really good thing you did. All you're really saying, the emotivists say, is you're saying, yay, giving to the kids, or yay, helping kittens, right? So emotivism then is, on this account, a variety of ethical subjectivism, right? Now, that's for people who have a sort of psychological bent or a psychological, or long for a psychological explanation for moral claims, right? There is another very, very important version of ethical subjectivism that, in fact, has a much more anthropological or historical bent, and turns to anthropology and history to try to explain, well, what moral claims are. This position is called cultural relativism. Hopefully, this term, cultural relativism, sounds familiar to you. It was the focus of the article that hopefully you read for today. So, cultural relativism is the position that there are no universal moral truths. I'll cross this up. Tell you what, I'll erase this and start over from scratch, since we're going to be talking about cultural relativism in some detail. But cultural relativism will be the focus of today's discussion, just for the purpose of filling out this little board and for giving you a taste of what's to come after we discuss cultural relativism and we move on through Mill and Kant and Aristotle. I will give you a brief account of what the next week of your life will be like, and we will turn our attention to the way to answer yes to this question. Are there moral facts? People who answer yes to this question, there are moral facts, there are moral truths, are known as moral realists. Moral realists are realists about morality. They believe morality really exists. They believe that moral claims express that claims about morality are either true or false, right? So when I say that murder is wrong, to the moral realist, I've said something that is objectively true, right? If I say that keeping slaves is wrong, I have said something that to the moral realist is objectively true. If I say that it's okay to kidnap children and keep them as your own, I have said something the moral realist says is objectively false. Right. Now, these are the real daredevils, right? They have to answer then the more complicated question. Well, okay, tough guy. If it's true there are moral facts, and they are universal and objective, they apply to all people everywhere, as the moral realist believes, then what are these moral facts? And how do you prove to me that that's one thing is objectively morally wrong if I'm a skeptic? And what we're going to see over the next week is we're going to see a few different approaches to answering this question from Mill and Kant and Aristotle. Okay? But for today, what we are going to talk about is the most interesting and influential variety of ethical subjectivism, cultural relativism. If you have taken a class on sociology or on anthropology, you might have talked about cultural relativism. It is very, very influential in those fields. Cultural relativism is the position that, in the first case, there are no universal, objective moral facts. Universal means applying to everybody everywhere. Objective means true regardless of any one particular person's point of view, right? And the cultural relativist believes that there are no moral claims, there are no moral facts that are independent of any person's moral, any one particular person's point of view, and there are no moral facts that apply to all people everywhere. Instead, what the cultural relativist believes is that moral claims about morality, reflect cultural attitudes or cultural values. And these cultural values are neither right nor wrong. So, moral claim. So, take anything that we want to say that is a claim about morality, like killing innocent people is wrong, right? That seems to be a widespread moral belief. But the cultural relativist will point out that, well, these moral claims, even claims like that seem so widespread, they only reflect certain kinds of cultural values, and those values themselves are neither right nor wrong. There's no objective position from which we can make the judgment that killing innocent people is right or wrong. All we can say is that some people have that value, and in fact, a lot of people have that value. Take another example. Take one that's very controversial now in a lot of developing countries and a lot of countries that are looking to be more Western and more modernized, and that is arranged marriages, right? Arranged marriages are when your parents decide for you who you are going to marry. Typically, this is done through some sort of relationship that your parents have. They select a mate for you. Very typically, there is money exchanged, perhaps from both sides, and your parents consider it to be a very good thing. In fact, part of their duty to find you a good mate, right? Now, here in Western nations, this strikes us as appalling, if not a form of slavery, particularly when, as is practiced in some, not all, but practiced in some nations where, girls are betrothed or promised to older men at the age of 13 or 14 to some, wealthy 40-year-old man. The girl is expected to not only be a good wife, but she is expected to be a good good homemaker, and so on. And she seems to have no autonomy over how her life is going to go. Something that strikes our Western sensibilities in the most sort of egregious way, right? Now, this seems wrong to a lot of us. It seems wrong to a lot of us to basically sell your daughters into this kind of institution, which amounts to a kind of slavery, right? But the cultural relativist is quick to point out, well, that's just a different culture. That's just how they do things. And in fact, the cultural relativist is most likely to point out that, well, the ugly fact of the matter is that the kind of Western attitudes that we have here in the United States and in places like Europe are the luxuries of people who have a lot of money and a lot of options in terms of our life plans, right? In less well-to-do countries, the fact of the matter is that a girl child is a liability. Her only option is to get married, and the sooner she can get married, the better, because the better that is for the family, right? And so there are ingrained cultural reasons, as abhorrent as those cultural reasons might strike us here in the West. The cultural relativists will point out that even abhorrent practices like this tend to serve some sort of larger sociological purpose. And really, they're quick to point out, what exactly is the alternative? Are you in the West going to adopt that 13-year-old girl who's about to be sold into marriage? Are you going to bring her to the United States and teach her Western ways and get her into college and so on? Well, no, we can't do that large scale. The truth is we have to deal with the facts on the ground, and the facts on the ground are that in a lot of these countries where that are not as well-to-do as we are in the West, there aren't any options for people in that position, right? So, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just making the cultural relativist claim, or the case for them, right? So, furthermore, it follows from the cultural relativist general position that not only do they view other cultures and their practices, no matter how strange and odd and backwards as they might seem, the cultural relativists also view our own Western practices as having no special status, and in fact often chide or correct us for thinking that our ways are the right ways, right? So the cultural relativist believes that the values of our own culture have no special status. And it is only arrogance to claim otherwise. So, this is the basics of cultural relativism. Now, often I find my students have a love-hate relationship with cultural relativism. There is a lot going for it, particularly for Spark Community College. You can't tell this from your position at home, but if we were in class right now, you would be looking around and you would see people from all walks of life. We get well-to-do people, we get people who are from lower socioeconomic status or stature, we get people from all over the world, we get people who wear hijabs, we get people who from all over the place. People who from Chinese students who are from SLU. We get people from all over the world in all different walks of life, right? As such, we being a cosmopolitan campus, it's easy to have a very casual cultural relativist attitude that we don't want to assume that our way of life, our way of dressing, our way of eating, our way of looking at the world is the right way, and that everybody else around us is just wrong or backwards or need to be properly educated in the Western world, right? So I find that a lot of, when first presented with cultural relativism, I find a lot of heads nodding, right? I find a lot of people saying, yeah, cultural relativism is right. There are no universal, it doesn't seem like there are any universal moral facts. On the other hand, I find a lot of my students are Christian. This is the beginning of philosophy, right? This is where I point out that, well, now wait a second. Cultural relativism and Christianity are mutually exclusive. At the most basic level, if you believe in Christianity, and I'm not just picking on Christianity, I'll pick on any of the major religions. If you believe in any of the major religions, you believe that there are universal moral facts that apply to everybody. People, for instance, sin against God, and if they are not in a state of grace, they go to hell, right? It's an objective fact that certain things like murder, in some cases divorce, and so on and so forth are sins, right? There is a cognitive dissonance there between some people who, on the one hand, want to assume a casual attitude of cultural relativism, at least when it comes to dealing with other people in their class, but at the end of the day, still believe that there are objective moral facts. And cultural relativism, it should be clear, as a philosophical position, totally rejects the idea that there could possibly be objective universal moral facts. Now, as such, given this controversy, some people wonder, well, why would anybody be a cultural relativist? Well, as I said before, cultural relativism is very appealing to people in anthropology class and in sociology class. Anthropologists and sociologists study human societies in the way that scientists study an anthill, right? They go into, tribes in rural Asia or in rural South America, and they want to study the tribes. They want to see what the cultural practices are. They want to see what they eat, what they wear, what gods they worship, how they do business, what their society is like. And they don't want to they don't want to observe them as people trying to help them, right? They don't want to, anthropologists don't want to go down to some Amazonian tribe and start handing out Bibles, right? And say, well, here is the way and the light. That's what missionaries do, right? Anthropologists want to go down and they just want to study human societies in the way that entomologists study a mound of anteaters, right? And so cultural relativism turns out to be a good tool, a good psychological tool to get yourself into before you go down and you study some Amazonian tribe, right? You want to get yourself in a position where, hey, I'm going to see some things down there that maybe I don't approve of. Maybe they're going to strike me as offensive, as a violation of human rights, and so on and so forth. But it is not my job to interfere, to object. It is just my job to record what I see, right? Now, there's no question then that cultural relativism is a useful scientific tool or mindset for studying human societies. The question here in ethics class is whether or not cultural relativism works as a general worldview. Does cultural relativism describe everything there is to know about the nature of morality and ethics? And here's where it runs into some problems, at least according to our author, James Rachels. James Rachels thinks that as useful and in some cases enlightening as the cultural relativist attitude goes, as a general worldview, it fails to answer some of the most basic questions about the nature of ethics. You can pause for a second. Okay. So James Rachels doesn't think cultural relativism works as a general worldview, and he is going to launch a two-pronged attack on cultural relativism as an answer to philosophical ethical questions. In the first case, Rachels is going to say that the best reason to be a cultural relativist doesn't work, right? And in the second case, Rachels says that if we take cultural relativism seriously, we run into a variety of very nonsensical problems. We run into a lot of things that don't make a lot of sense, right? So taking cultural relativism seriously has some really, really bad consequences and illogical consequences. So, okay. So in the first case, let's talk about the best reason to be a cultural relativist. If you ask a cultural relativist, why are you a cultural relativist? And I invite you to do this. Go to the anthropology department, pigeonhole a anthropology professor and say, hey, why are you a cultural relativist? Go, right? Now, if they don't call security on you and they take your answer seriously or your question seriously, they're probably going to give you some version of this response. They're going to say, well, if you read about other lands, let alone if you go to visit other lands, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, China, all these different places, what you're going to find is that people in these different parts of the world, well, they have very, very different ideas about good and bad and right and wrong, what things are acceptable behavior, right? They have very, very different moral codes. To choose choose an example ripped from the headlines, if you go to China, in China, they do not value human rights in the same way that we do, particularly when it comes to freedom of speech, right? Here in the United States, we take it as both a political value and a moral value that I have the freedom to express myself, right? I can say what I want to say, and if I want to write an editorial about a public official, I can do that. I can do that even if it causes unrest, even if it causes problems for that public official. This is not a political or moral value shared by most people in China. In China, the Chinese government has basically unlimited authority to shut down any sort of speech that they find seditious or contrary to the good of society, right? Take another example. We consider it both a political value and a moral value that we have the ability to express our religion, right? I can be whatever religion I like. I can even be I can even have no religion. If I decide one day that I don't want to be a Christian anymore, I can renounce my Christianity and ain't nobody got anything to say about it, right? I don't want to paint with too broad a brush about the Middle East, but there are a variety of countries in the Middle East where this would be very, very, very politically and socially controversial. If you have no religion, if you have a religion contrary to Islam, let alone that you are a Muslim who renounces your faith, you might be in for a variety of both moral, social, and political problems, right? So these are just a few examples taken at random, right? And the anthropologist that you cornered is likely to say something along these lines. Give these examples. Say, well, things that we consider to be fundamental moral and political values here in the United States are quite the opposite. In fact, they're considered unimportant, even abhorrent in other countries. And those other countries, though they have their own problems, they're not failed states. They function pretty well, and they just they get along with their own set of values. Therefore, and here's the problem. Therefore, the anthropologist will say that proves that there are no universal, objective, moral, or political values, right? Now, to break this argument down into its constituent parts, Rachel calls this the cultural differences argument, and it goes very simply. Here's the cultural differences argument. The cultural differences argument proceeds this way. The anthropologist says, different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there are no objective facts about right and wrong. Thank you for my proofreader. Thank you, Beth, my lovely assistant and proofreader. Okay, let's start that again. The cultural differences argument. We'll edit this out later. This is not going to broadcast. The cultural differences argument goes this way. Different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there are no objective facts about right and wrong. Right? Now, what does Rachel's think of this argument? Well, Rachel's doesn't think much of this argument. As common as this argument is, he thinks that it fails, and it fails in a very fundamental way. And his example is this, that you can't get from 1 to 2. And a few counterexamples prove this case. Consider this. Different cultures throughout time, throughout geography, have different opinions about all sorts of things. For instance, lots of different cultures throughout history and throughout different locations in the world have very, very different attitudes about the size and the shape of the Earth. right? Some cultures have believed the Earth is flat. Some cultures have believed that the sun revolves around the Earth, and so on, right? Now, different cultures believe different things about the size and the shape of the Earth. Does it follow that there are no facts of the matter about the size and the shape of the Earth? Well, no, of course not. All that follows is that some cultures are right and some cultures are wrong. Some cultures are just, and I don't mean that necessarily in a moral sense. I mean simply that, a culture that thinks that the Earth is flat and that the sun revolves around the Earth, they're just mistaken, right? And when presented with the evidence that they're wrong, they are expected to change, right? Change their attitudes, right? So Rachel thinks that the best reason, the cultural differences argument, the default argument to establish cultural relativism as a fact about the nature of ethical claims, he thinks that this just falls apart. This just isn't persuasive. Now, he thinks, in addition to the best reason to be a cultural relativist, the fact of the matter is there are a variety of bad results of being a cultural relativist. A bunch of things that the cultural relativists don't want to acknowledge and don't want to accept, and that run contrary to our common sense. So, let's go over those. Okay, so next Rachel wants to turn his attention to the consequences of taking cultural relativism seriously as a worldview. And again, we're not just talking about taking cultural relativism seriously out in the field if you're studying some rural tribe in northern Canada. We're talking about taking cultural relativism seriously as an answer to all of our moral and ethical questions. Right. So, Rachel thinks there are a few counterintuitive and, in fact, ridiculous consequences of taking cultural relativism seriously. And I've written them down. So, here are the consequences, as Rachel sees, of taking cultural relativism seriously. In the first case, we could no longer say that other societies' cultures are inferior to our own. Now, if you're a cultural relativist, you don't think this is a defect. You think this is just a description of what you believe. But it does have some might say unsavory, some might say totally preposterous results, right? What if one society practiced slavery, right? We don't have to be too hypothetical about this. There is become an increasing awareness over the past 10 or 20 years of slavery being practiced in one form or another around the world. For instance, certain countries putting out ads to hey, are you a teenager looking for work? Well, come to our country with free room and board. We'll pay for your passage here. Anyway, you're from a disadvantaged society. And maybe you don't even speak the language. You come and you answer this ad. You come and basically you work as a slave, right? You are expected to do all the housework. You're beaten even. You speak none of the language, so it's not like you can go to the local embassy or anything, right? And this is not just a one-off example. There are lots and lots of cases. This is a widely practiced. This is widely used practice in certain cases around the world, and this amounts to simply to slavery, right? And we think this is morally wrong, and it doesn't matter whether or not in a particular society this is considered normal. This is slavery, right? Furthermore, there are some countries, I will leave those countries nameless because I don't want to pick any fights with any people, but there are some countries where it's well known that the society overlooks child prostitution, and these countries become these tourist destinations for people from wealthy countries to go and have sex with children, right? Now, do we want to say that this is, hey, when in country X, it's fine because the society approves of it? Well, no, we think that this is just plain wrong, right? Now, next we get into an even more unpleasant issue. This is really the crown jewel of making this case, that there are some cultural practices that are just absolutely abhorrent, and no civilized society would tolerate them. And it has to do with what is euphemistically called female circumcision, right? And there are many countries. Again, I leave you to look up where they are. I don't want to pick on any particular part of the world. It's actually more parts of the world than you probably think. There are a variety of countries around the world where a young woman is not considered fit for marriage until she has undergone a certain cultural ritual in which various parts of her vagina are surgically removed, including, in a lot of places, the clitoris, right? Now, this, I'm no doctor, but this does not tickle. This is a painful, often a painful procedure. I want to call it a medical procedure, but it's not a medical procedure. It's often done by people who have no more expertise than the fact that it was done to them and that it's been practiced for years, and to prepare the young lady for marriage, they just start hacking off pieces of her genitalia, right? Now, this disgusts a lot of people. It raises the rankles of a lot of people, and a lot of people consider this practice to be absolutely, totally unacceptable, right? Now, what is the cultural relativist attitude towards this? Well, the cultural relativist attitude towards this, as you might imagine, is that, well, different strokes for different folks. That's how they do it there. That's considered normal there. And maybe it will change over time, but, we're no better than they are, right? And I don't think that most people find that to be a plausible explanation of comparative cultures, right? I think, now, granted, we in the West are not perfect. You can find a variety of things that a variety of practices that we engage in that abhor other people, but at the very least, I think that when you point to a lot of these cases seem to be utterly abhorrent, utterly awful, and that those societies should stop what they're doing, right? But if you accept cultural relativism as a general worldview, then you can make no such claim, right? Secondly, Rachel thinks if we take cultural relativism seriously as a worldview, we could decide whether our actions are justified merely by consulting common practice, merely by looking at what is commonly done. And this leads to a kind of a really unsavory version of conservatism, right? Take, for instance, a white person in the South during segregation, or for that matter, a black person in the South during segregation, circa 1955, right? When there's a lot of, where there begins to be a lot of cultural push to desegregate. Segregation in the South was various policies, both cultural and actually legal, where whites and white people and black people went to different churches, they went to different schools, they shopped at different shopping malls, and so on, right? They were kept segregated, they were kept away from each other, and there began in the 1950s to be a major cultural questioning about whether or not this was a good practice. Now, let's say that you are a person in the South, and you are trying to figure out whether or not you should go join the protests to try to desegregate. Whether or not you should, even in your own private moments in your heart of hearts, be against segregation? Well, if cultural relativism is true, you can easily settle this issue by just asking yourself, well, is segregation commonly practiced? Is it normal? And of course it's normal. People widely accept it. In fact, both blacks and whites in the South commonly accepted it and followed the rules. So segregation, which now strikes us as abhorrent, back then you could decide whether that segregation, was just peachy keen. Well, everybody's doing it, so what basis is there for anyone to object? And this is just one example of a case where a serious cultural issue that needs changing, that is manifestly unjust, can be decided just by appealing to common practice. And to Rachel's and critics of cultural relativism, that seems to be silly. It seems to be an untenable result, a good reason to reject cultural relativism, right? And in fact, if you believe in cultural relativism, there seems to be no ability to appeal to justice of any kind, except for common practice. You can't say, well, yeah, lots of people do it, but it's wrong. Lots of people do it, but it's unjust. There is no unjust. Lots of people do it, therefore, it's fine. Thirdly, Rachel points out the idea of moral progress must be abandoned. And in fact, no society could ever change for the better. Cultural relativism is not just a matter of judging societies from place to place, from geographical location to geographical location. It's also a policy of judging societies from one period of time to the next, right? And as such, we would have to reject the idea that any society ever improved over time, which seems manifestly, obviously untrue. Say what you want about the United States in 2020. We have lots and lots and lots of problems, including lots and lots of racial problems, but I think all of us, even the most cynical among us, would have to agree that the United States in 2020 has at least improved one way since 1820, and that is that chattel slavery is illegal. Now, there are lots and lots of ways in which the legacy of slavery are still alive today. In fact, we could make a good case that slavery as an institution has not been fully abolished, but in fact is adapted. I'm sympathetic to a lot of those arguments. But at the very least, we have the 13th Amendment. At the very least, slavery as it was practiced in 1820 is no longer a thing. So that, as incremental as that might be, seems to constitute a kind of improvement. But if you're a cultural relativist, you just have to shrug your shoulders and say, well, different strokes for different folks, right? Same thing for, take another example, the rounding up and concentrating of Jews, of Jewish people in the 1930s, right? A common practice among the Nazis, right? No longer practiced, now considered to be one of the most evil historical horrors ever perpetrated by human beings. What do the cultural relativists say about that? Well, they might hem and haw a little bit about how, well, that's an example of maybe one group of people, not necessarily being in the majority and abusing their power and whatnot. But still, the idea that one society can improve over another society still has to be fundamentally rejected, right? And that just seems wrong. It just seems intuitively wrong. It seems to go contrary to our very common sense. Right. So, Rachels then concludes that the most influential way of denying there are moral facts, cultural relativism, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It might be helpful to anthropologists and sociologists as a kind of therapeutic or professional tool, but it doesn't answer the fundamental questions about the nature and content of morality. So, what does? So we've knocked down the best reason to answer no to the question of whether or not there are moral facts. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to turn our attention to the different ways of answering yes, there are moral facts. And now, if we're going to answer yes, there are moral facts, well, we have to be able to say, well, what those moral facts are and how we prove to skeptics that the moral facts that we espouse are the moral facts that the skeptic should espouse as well. So, what we are going to see over the next few classes, we are going to see John Stuart Mill next for tomorrow, laying out the philosophy of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, the belief that actions are good to the degree they promote happiness and bad to the degree they promote misery. After that, we are going to read Immanuel Kant, who thinks that happiness and misery have absolutely nothing to do with morality. Kant thinks that there are certain moral duties that are written right into the very idea of a human being, and that we must always fulfill our moral duties. We are going to finish up with Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that there are moral facts, but the moral facts break down to the virtues, the good human practices, the admirable human traits. And if we try as best we can to be a good person, to think about, well, what would a good person do, then we, for the most part, will always do right. So that's a forecast of the next few days of your life. So it has been called to my attention that some of you do not have books yet. I sympathize. I don't have a book yet. I don't have a copy of the 5th edition of the book. Hopefully you found the Rachel's article for today that I posted up online. The Mill article for 2 days from now, I guess for tomorrow. You'll be seeing this tomorrow. The Mill article for tomorrow is also posted up online. I'm doing my best to get a copy of the Kant and Aristotle articles to get those up. I don't want that to interfere with anybody's ability to pass the quizzes. So, okay. If you have any questions or any comments, please let me know. I do want to take this opportunity to encourage anybody to participate in the discussion board that's available online. The discussion board, it's no substitute for in-class dialogue, but it's a great place to sort of sound off, to interact with some of your peers, ask questions, express concerns. I will pop in there once in a while and maybe add to the conversation. But under these circumstances, the best we got. So I encourage you to make use of it. It is in Blackboard under Tools. It's a little hard to find. It's in Blackboard under Tools, and you will see the discussion board. Okay, that is totally up to you if you would like to participate, but I want to encourage you to do it. Okay, so. Okay. Oops, that was louder than I expected. Okay, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks a lot.